Today I'd like to present to you another Band 9 sample answer in Task 1 from Cambridge IELTS 17. You have 20 minutes to complete the task. Let's get started. The charts below show the proportions of total energy production from 5 sources: coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear and renewables in Country A and Country B in 1990 and 2020. And here is my answer. The 2 pie charts illustrate the proportions of total energy production derived from 5 major sources: coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear power and renewables in Country A and Country B in the years 1990 and 2020. At first glance, it is immediately apparent that both countries underwent notable transformations in their energy mix during the 30-year span, yet their directions diverged in meaningful ways. While Country A deliberately shifted away from a heavy reliance on fossil fuels and adopted nuclear and renewable energy to an impressive degree, Country B continued to rely predominantly on conventional fuels, making only incremental adjustments toward cleaner alternatives. In 1990, coal accounted for nearly half of Country A's total energy output. Still, by 2020, this figure had plummeted to a minor share, replaced largely by nuclear power, which surged from negligible levels to around 1/3, and renewables, which more than doubled to approximately a quarter. This demonstrates a clear strategic pivot toward sustainability and energy security. By contrast, Country B in 1990 displayed a more balanced energy profile, with oil and natural gas collectively dominating at around 60% and coal making up about 20%. However, by 2020, little substantive progress had been made. Fossil fuels still provided the lion's share of energy, with only a modest increase in renewable sources and a marginal introduction of nuclear power. Thus, the overall picture highlights a striking divergence. Country A exemplifies dynamic reform toward a cleaner and more diversified energy future, whereas Country B remains largely tethered to its fossil fuel dependency with only tentative steps toward diversification. Now let's analyze the sample answer in detail. In Task 1, you always need to start with an overview. Here we have 2 pie charts and we can see that both countries have changed their energy production over the period. However, they have done so in different ways. That's why in my overview I say that the 2 charts provide a striking contrast between the 2 countries. Also, you should always try to use some of the formal vocabulary from the task in your overview. Here we have 5 energy sources and you can see that I mentioned 4 of them. I didn't mention natural gas because it was not easy to remember. Nuclear and renewables is fine. It's actually better than saying nuclear and renewable energy because it's shorter. Also, I didn't say renewables production. I just said renewables because it's a collective noun. Think of it as a team. The renewables team consists of several types of energy: solar, wind, hydro, etc. So you don't need to say renewables production. Okay, next. So what is the main idea of each chart? Well, in Country A, we can see that there is a very big change from 1990 to 2020. The proportion of coal has decreased dramatically. The proportion of nuclear power and renewables has increased significantly. And in Country B, we can see that the proportions of all energy sources are quite similar in 1990 and 2020. There is no big change. Yes, you could say that renewables increased slightly, but that's a minor change. Okay, now you know what to write about in each paragraph, but how to write about them? How to describe the charts? Well, if you look at my answer, you can see that I used quite sophisticated vocabulary and grammar. For example, at first glance, it is immediately apparent that both countries underwent notable transformations in their energy mix during the 30 years, yet their directions diverged in meaningful ways. I believe that this complexity is exactly what examiners are looking for in Band 9 answers. They want to see what you can do. So don't be afraid to use complex sentences if you can. If you try to write a simple sentence like this and try to connect it with "and," you will end up with a simple sentence again. If you use a complex sentence and try to connect it with "and," you will end up with a complex sentence again. So try to be more adventurous when writing your Task 1 report. Let's take a look at the next part of the overview. I described what happened in each country. Now I need to show how they are different from each other. While Country A deliberately shifted away from a heavy reliance on fossil fuels and adopted nuclear and renewable energy to an impressive degree, Country B continued to rely predominantly on conventional fuels, making only incremental adjustments toward cleaner alternatives. Again, this is pretty complex. We have 2 subordinate clauses connected with while and although, and we also have conditional forms, depending on and depend. So it's quite advanced, but it's all about showing how the 2 countries are different. And I believe that this is exactly what the examiner is looking for. Okay, now I'm going to describe each chart in more detail. And as you can see, I'm using the direct method. I'm directly describing the data and explaining what happened. In 1990, coal accounted for nearly half of Country A's total energy output. Still, by 2020, this figure had plummeted to a minor share, replaced largely by nuclear power, which surged from negligible levels to around 1/3, and renewables, which more than doubled to approximately a quarter. This demonstrates a clear strategic pivot towards sustainability and energy security. As you can see, I'm describing what happened to each source. First, I talk about coal. I say what it was in 1990 and then I compare it to 2020. Then I move on to the next source. I talk about nuclear power. Again, I say what it was in 1990 and then I compare it to 2020. And finally, I talk about renewables. And then I explain what these changes show. This is an optional sentence, but I think it's a good idea to include it because it shows that you understand what is going on. You're not just describing the data, you're explaining it. Okay, now let's take a look at the second paragraph. Country B in 1990 displayed a more balanced energy profile with oil and natural gas collectively dominating at around 60% and coal making up about 20%. However, by 2020, little substantive progress had been made. Fossil fuels still provided the lion's share of energy with only a modest increase in renewable sources and a marginal introduction of nuclear power. Thus, the overall picture highlights a striking contrast between the two countries. In this paragraph, I talked about both countries together. I described what happened in each country and then I explained how the two countries are different. Notice that I didn't just say that country B is different because it didn't make any changes. That would be wrong. It made some changes, but those changes were insignificant. So it's not really different. I would say that the changes are insignificant or the changes are barely noticeable or the difference is insignificant. Okay, in this part, you can also use some linking devices. For example, on the other hand, on the one hand, on the other hand, however, nevertheless, despite the fact that. These are all common linking devices used in Task 1 to link ideas together. Now let's take a look at the vocabulary used in this answer. It's quite advanced and varied. You can see that I used words like paltry and negligible, which means very small. Also, I used words like surge, which is a sudden increase, and plummeted, which is a sudden decrease. And then I also used words like incremental adjustments, which is a slight change. And this word pivot. To pivot is to change direction. This is very common in Task 1. For example, we have a pivot from coal to renewables. And I also used a very interesting phrase to wrap up my answer. The overall picture highlights a striking contrast between the two countries. I think it's a very nice way to finish your answer because it's not just a summary of what you have written. It's something more. It's like a conclusion. And finally, let's talk about some features that examiners may not like in your answer. What do they call it? Examiner-friendly language. Some of the things they don't like are very general statements. For example, you shouldn't say that country A reduced its dependence on coal. Why? Because you don't know why they did it. Maybe it was more expensive. Or you shouldn't say that country B hardly made any changes. Again, you don't know why they didn't make any changes. Maybe they were happy with their energy mix or maybe they couldn't afford to make changes. Don't speculate. You should only write about what you can see in the charts. Another thing that examiners don't like is opinion. For example, you shouldn't say that country A is better than country B. Who decides that? You are the one deciding that. And finally, don't compare the two countries too much because you're not required to do that. The question asks you to describe two charts. It doesn't ask you to compare them. Only occasionally does the question require you to show differences between two things. When it does, you should do so. But most of the time you just need to describe two charts. And that's all I wanted to say today. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your preparation and your exam. Bye.